What's up, nerds? The US Army is learning a lot of lessons out of the war in Ukraine, just like any other army in the rest of the world. But none of these lessons are more pertinent, really, to the United States Army and its process of transformation and modernization. This is kind of a rolling process. Everything kind of feeds into this learning base and kind of helps the Army learn how to, further develop its force, but also how to fight the next war. So we're going to read basically along in a foreign policy article here by Jack Detch. Hope I pronounced your name right. But this is a really great article it's titled, America's Next Soldiers Will Be Machines. In future wars, U.S. generals want to send robots to face the enemy's first bullets. Now, this is going to be very interesting because this article is basically talking about how the Army is pulling lessons out of the war in Ukraine. This is something that I can speak to a little bit just from conversations that I've had and kind of, lessons that we've been pulling, not only on this channel, but in other places. And I think that this is going to be kind of an interesting way to kind of showcase, how the Army is learning from this war. So we'll go ahead and read along here. And I have the link to this article down in the description. So definitely click it, give it, share it on some other platforms as well, and read along with me there as well. So here, starting off. For as long as the United States has had an army, U.S. infantry soldiers have stuck by one motto: don't shoot until you see the whites of their eyes. But fighting on the U.S. Army's largest training ground last month, Lieutenant Isaac McCurdy and his platoon of infantry troops, which, by the way, I've been called McCurdy so many times in my life that, like, whenever I read that guy's name, I was just kind of like, dude, what? Is this guy me? No. Anyway, leading his platoon of infantry troops, playing a fictional enemy of the United States, found themselves up against a very different kind of foe. One with camera lenses for eyes and sheet metal for skin. Were they fighting the automatons in Bavelian Creek?
Sweet liberty, my land!
These weren't your average flesh and blood men that they were fighting. They were machines. Driving on 8 screeching wheels and carrying enough firepower on their truck beds to fit a small arms depot, a handful of U.S. Army robots stormed through the battlefield of the fictional city of Yuzhny. Interesting. The robots shot up houses where the opposition force hid. Drones that had been loitering over the battlefield for hours hovered above McCurdy and his team and dropped bombs. Foam footballs in this case. A perfectly placed artillery shot. Robot dogs with sensors for heads searched houses to make sure that they were clear. That's got to be pretty terrifying if you were not expecting that. You're expecting to fight a human being and then an army of freaking robots shows up. If you see the whites of someone's eyes or their sunglasses and you shoot back at that, they're going to have a human response, McCurdy said. Shooting something that's bigger than you can carry yourself, and it's not going to just die when you shoot center mass. It's a very different feeling. That's actually a really good point because, suppressive fire is a pretty good tactical principle. But can you suppress a robot? Because it's not going to die and it doesn't necessarily have a fear of getting shot. So, you've got to shoot to kill. And you can't necessarily just suppress it. So, covering the movement of soldiers from position to position's got to be way harder if you know that you're going up against a robot, not an actual human being, because you can't suppress a robot. That's an interesting point there. The Army's top officer, General Randy George, made the trip from the Pentagon to watch the fictitious battle. Standing on the rooftop of a makeshift stucco building that swayed from the tank rounds thudding against the desert sand, he was flanked by a half-dozen top generals and about as many colonels. Many of them wore metal wristbands engraved with the names of soldiers who died under the commands in Iraq and Afghanistan. In the United States' next major war, the Army's brass is hoping that robots will be the ones taking the first punch, doing the dirty, dull, and dangerous jobs that killed hundreds, likely thousands, of the more than 7,000 U.S. service members who died during 2 decades of wars in the Middle East. The goal is to put a robot in the most dangerous spot on the battlefield instead of a 19-year-old private fresh out of basic training. Because it's talking about, U.S. soldiers who died, in the Middle East, during the War on Terror, I think this is kind of an interesting point. I don't think that this article is going to discuss it, but it's these robots can be a great, tool for large-scale combat operations, U.S. versus another near-peer military or something like that, more conventional fighting. But in this case, in the Middle East, how much, counterinsurgency where you're really, you're fighting for hearts and minds, you're trying to change, the mindset of a populace, and you're fighting an insurgency, how I'm sure robots would do some good, but would the local population feel good seeing a robot patrolling around with soldiers, or even worse, seeing just a robot and not soldiers? It would definitely help prevent U.S. deaths, which is a great thing. But at the same time, for changing hearts and minds, what does that image kind of conjure up? Does it conjure up trust and a feeling of protection, or does that conjure up skepticism and fear? I think that, but again, that's kind of, we're kind of supposedly moving away from counterinsurgency to large scale combat operations, kind of more the bread and butter of what the Army is. But I don't think coin's ever going to go away. We're really just going to be kind of balancing both at the same time. Not all of these machines are ready for prime time though. During the Fort Irwin exercise dubbed Project Convergence, which was designed, that sounds like a quest name, which was designed to test robots in realistic combat scenarios, they didn't face live bullets. The robots didn't have peripheral vision. They couldn't look left or right like a human soldier can by simply turning their head. And the Army's outdated network can't always keep hundreds of drones aloft at the same time, or even tell U.S. troops which of the unpiloted aircraft are friend or foe. But they've come a long way. George and other Army leaders believe that almost every U.S. Army unit, down to the smallest foot patrols, will soon have a drone in the sky to sense, protect, and attack. And it won't be long before the United States is deploying ground robots into battle in human-machine teams. Quote, "It's not just one robot that replaces one human," said Alex Miller, Georgia's chief technology officer. "The question," he said, "is how the Army can put robots on the front line without taking a single rifleman or multiple riflemen off the line to control a robot." This is also another thing. It'll kind of reduce the need for the Army to kind of meet some of its recruitment goals. I mean, you're always, nothing's going to replace an infantryman and his rifle. You're just never going to get rid of that. But at the same time, you can augment them, and, drones and, these kinds of ground robots are going to be a huge deal. But, and that'll be a force multiplier. And I kind of wonder, so much so, if you will need to really beef up the force in a significant way during a big war. Think about, during World War II, where the Army was, several million individuals large. Will you need to get to a force that large? If you can really just produce, cheaper robots that may be actually more effective on the ground, and also, it's not a human life that you're putting at risk. That might be kind of an interesting thing to look at there. You could be forgiven if you didn't know that there was a U.S. Army training base nearly the size of Rhode Island in the middle of the California desert. After all, Fort Irwin isn't easy to get to. Pull off Interstate 15, go through the city of Barstow, and drive another 23 or so miles. You'll see a big pile of rocks. Boulders of basalt formed millions of years ago when an ancient volcano erupted, painted with Army insignias. You'll see the red and blue shield of the 197th Infantry Brigade and the black and yellow Norman shield and the horse silhouette of the 1st Cavalry Division. Every logo symbolizes a different Army unit that has trained here, about 10 every year. That's how you know you're at Fort Irwin. The isolation is the point. Soldiers call the massive training range the box. That's because it's basically a sandbox for military exercises. One of the only places in the continental United States where you can jam the electromagnetic spectrum, fly drones at 30,000 feet, and fire large munitions without bothering anybody. This sounds awesome. Fort Irwin contains 14 fictional cities and 1,200 buildings. Once troops arrive, they're here for 21 days with no showers. Yeah, so this is actually the home of NTC, the National Training Center, and like they said, they rotate a lot of units through almost annually to basically put them through hell, train them in conditions that are hopefully harder than what they will find whenever they're deployed. So whenever they're in the real thing, they're prepared. They've been through an exercise that has really challenged them and has forced them to think outside the box and has made them uncomfortable. So whenever they are uncomfortable in the real world, doing real stuff, it's not that, they've been there before. They can fall back on their training. Life in the desert is hard. In a January exercise, U.S. Army troops had to brave wind, rain, sleet, snow, and oppressive heat, sometimes all in one day. There are about 1,200 fake casualties for every 3-week rotation. Service members in one of the brigades that deployed here for that mock battle with the 1st Armored Division had to carry their artillery with them 40 miles into battle. Okay, so the article just kind of, continues here talking about NTC and what it is and how it's hard. And it's very important. Here's kind of what I was saying here before. The idea is for the Army to do most of its bleeding in training. not on the battlefield. So organizers try to make the simulated enemy tougher than the real one. Not like the Russians who stumbled into Ukraine with maps from the 1980s looking for towns that didn't exist. The fighting that Ukrainian troops have experienced on the battlefield inside Mariupol's Azovstal steel plant, around the city of Kharkiv, and during the liberation of Kherson has forced the army to adapt even further. Quote, originally we had units actually knocking on doors because that's what they learned in Iraq and Afghanistan, said Major General Kurt Taylor, the commander of the National Training Center. That's going to get you killed. And more often than not, soldiers have to hold their simulated fire. There are paid actors roaming around Irwin playing civilians caught in the crossfire. The scenarios are also starting to include robots. Today, the army might have 3 platoons deployed in a basic attack. McCurdy said, 1 to fix the enemy in place, another to maneuver on them, and then 1 more in reserve. Put robots in that group of soldiers, and they suddenly have much more room to maneuver. Quote, then you have basically 3 platoons entirely freed up, McCurdy said. And it also draws far more enemy attention to those harder targets of the robots. It protects you, frees you up, gives you more flexibility, and weakens up all other fronts of the enemy defenses. Quote, I'm not 100% sure how they would work against it, said Sergeant Philip Webb, the weapons squad leader for the opposing force in the exercise. You know, it's definitely, because like, how do you, you know, and we've seen this actually, we've seen the Russians use actually something similar to this in Ukraine. There was an image of, you know, 2 ground drones that appeared to have been disabled, but were kind of somewhat resembled what the army has, where it's kind of like a wheeled vehicle that has, you know, a grenade launcher on the front, you know, kind of like their Mark 19 equivalent, and then it can carry some baggage on the back. And it appeared that those 2 had been disabled. Now, I'm not quite sure what disabled it, if you know, small arms fire is enough to disable it, or if it takes something heavier. I guess it depends on how armored it is. I would assume if it's not that up armor, that maybe, you know, small arms fire could punch through the electronics, and that could be it. But if that's the case, you know, then you've got to harden the thing. And how much are you reinventing a tank but without people, and forcing the enemy, you know, to use like, you know, their AT weapons against a drone basically, which is also much smaller. That definitely, it poses a bit of a dilemma for infantry on the ground. That might not be true on every battlefield. Like everything here, Project Convergence is an experiment. It's hard to stop a robot from rolling along Fort Irwin's sand and volcanic rock, which has plenty of traction for the Army's small multi-purpose equipment transports to move freely across. And soldiers haven't shot any real-life ammunition at these robots yet. A well-placed shot to the sensor might render a ground robot functionally useless. Well, there we go. And robots might turn into expensive icicles at the British military's largest training ground in the hostile winters of the Canadian province of Alberta. Yeah, that's, you know, because it's like we've talked about how terrain, you know, in some cases can pose some restrictive challenges on heavier equipment. You know, how does the terrain and how does the climate work with drones? How does it impact aircraft? You know, we know that it impacts aircraft, for instance, but how does it impact other kinds of drones, like ground drones, for instance? That's going to be kind of an interesting challenge. How can you weatherproof it? Like, how much can you weatherproof it? And what impact, you know, there, again, like I said before, there's no replacement for the infantrymen. And so drones will be a nice augmentation. But again, in case of, you know, harsh weather or harsh terrain, you may not be able to lean on drones as heavily as you really would wish that you could. A desert's, you know, kind of like a tough spot to test it. It's a good spot to test it because, again, it's hot. It's uncomfortable for human people, and it's harsh for humans. But for a robot and for like heavier equipment, it's flat, it's open. The ground can support it. You can kind of drive around and do whatever you want, right? It's open because you can build whatever you want. But again, you know, if you're looking at like a case like in Ukraine, it may not always be flat. It may not always be wide open, and it's not always going to be warm. You know, sometimes it's going to get really, really cold. And, you know, how is that going to impact maneuverability for these drones? And I think that's going to be something to kind of test out. I believe it's JRTC down in Louisiana. That might be another interesting environment to test this out in, or maybe even up in Alaska, where you're kind of, you know, you're dealing with a more humid, more, you know, kind of rugged, you know, more dense environment, lots of, you know, foliage and stuff like that. That might be interesting to test it out in, as well as in Alaska, where it's just absolutely freezing. That might be an interesting place to just put these things through the ringer and see, you know, how they augment infantry in different environments. And, whether there are some environments where you're just not going to be able to rely on the ground drones as much. The quadcopters, can definitely be any environment for the most part. Drones are already ubiquitous. You can buy a quadcopter off the shelf for about $50 at most big box stores. But building ground robots that can see and sense their way through modern battlefields is much harder. But the entire field of military robotics is speeding up. Ukraine has already pledged to create a separate service branch for drones and unmanned vehicles. The U.S. Army might not be too far off. It's considering a proposal to add a platoon of robots, the equivalent of 20 to 50 human soldiers, to its armored brigade combat teams, which are the service's bread and butter tank-based infantry units. That might be interesting. Again, how does that kind of work? And who's controlling them? Are you going to have, the controllers deployed and, like in the field with you? Can you control them from farther? I know that, in some cases with Ukraine, a lot of the drone pilots are right there in the trench with them. So, I don't think that, you're still going to have humans there. So if you have a platoon of robots, are you also going to have like a separate platoon of the robot controllers? Is that going to be part of that, robot platoon? And, do you just is that your reserve element for maneuvering? I'm not, that'll be interesting to see how that kind of gets worked out there. Army officials don't think that robots will replace humans or that they will do much to solve the problem of recruiting shortfalls. Well, there we go. But they're working on the math to get the ratio of humans to robots to about 2 to 1 or 3 to 1. That's interesting. The point is to get the advantage before China and Russia do. We don't want to be even, said Lieutenant General John Morrison, the principal advisor to the Army's Chief of Staff for Network and Cybersecurity. We want to be a technical overmatch. Well, and that kind of follows the principle that the Army always takes, and really that the U.S. military always takes. You're not looking for a fair fight, you're looking for an unfair fight. And you're constantly trying to innovate and adapt in ways that the enemy just cannot keep up with. If the and also that being said, consider that Russia's getting real world, large scale combat operation experience right now. And we are not. And that's a good, it's a good thing that we're not, because hopefully nobody should be getting large scale combat operations experience. But it's not necessarily a good thing for us that they're learning lessons, up close and personal, and we're kind of having to learn secondhand through Ukraine and through observation. It's a good thing that we are learning that we have that kind of access and that we're not having to lose people to that. So that, that's not what I'm saying that we should be involved, but that's something to consider. The fidelity of lessons, I guess, that we might be pulling away may not be as close as, what the Russians or what the Ukrainians themselves are getting. We have to rely on what's shared to us and what we can observe from afar. If the Russia-Ukraine war has taught the Army anything about the future of warfare, it's to look up. Soldiers are listening for drones and coming up with battle drills to defend against them. If something can be seen or sensed, it can be killed. And there's actually a pretty interesting video by Grantham that he did, I want to say a couple months ago, where he was interviewing 2 veterans from the war in Ukraine. I think it was like a British guy and an American guy, and they were talking about how to survive in the modern battlefield. And they had a battle drill for dealing with drones, where they're looking, listening, observing, smelling, whatever the acronym is. They, one of them, let's say the lead guy, here's a drone, he calls it out, and then everybody basically runs to a bush, or runs to some sort of cover. And then they wait for it to overpass, or they wait for somebody to get a shot to shoot it. It's kind of interesting that that's going to be a battle drill. It's going to have to be taught in like basic training, and like that's not training that I received coming in, because that wasn't a thing that was going on at that time. So they're they're going to have to come up with a battle drill for that. They're going to have to come up with doctrine, and they're going to have to equip incoming soldiers with that kind of knowledge, at the very least, so that they feel like they have, a kind of counter to that capability. To survive on the modern battlefield, soldiers are having to make themselves smaller and smaller, almost invisible. Loitering munitions can wait over the battlefield for hours, ready to dive if an operator senses the faintest twitch. Fort Irwin's mock enemy troops have 105 drone swarms that can attack with dozens to hundreds of small unmanned planes at times. Unwieldy server stacks and satellite dishes sticking out the U.S. vehicles and outposts could get soldiers killed. And U.S. troops will probably have to turn off their iPhones and Androids, which are rippling through the electromagnetic spectrum. Quote, "The cell phone is the new cigarette in the foxhole," said Taylor, the training center commander. "We've shown soldiers, hey, your cell phone can get you killed." Taylor and his team recently spotted an otherwise undetectable Apache helicopter weaving through air defenses when they clocked the pilot's iPhone doing 120 miles per hour across the desert. You know, this is actually something that's pretty interesting that I've had conversations about, that's been a conversation in a lot of places on. There was an article published by one general, I think it was a couple generals, titled "The Death of the Command Post," and I'll have that link down below as well. But basically, the whole thesis of the article is that the electromagnetic signature for a command post is so great in the ability for like adversaries, like say the Russians or the Iranians, or really anybody that can pick up an electromagnetic, signature and has some sort of long-range precision fires. They can hit a command post with a ballistic missile attack, or something else like that pretty quickly once they pick up that signature. So now it's really going to be incumbent on every single headquarters to become nimbler, more dispersed. What is the answer going to be towards that kind of problem? And how are they going to counter your cell phone not only being a signature, but your telecommunications equipment? And the more dispersed that you get, the more reliant you're going to be on that equipment. If your whole command post is dispersed over a large area, to avoid becoming one large target, then, for instance, cyber, could become a real problem where if you lose access to your network, now they've capability killed your command post. If they force you to, reconverge back to a single point because you lost access to your network, now, again, you're a target once more for a single attack. So that's definitely becoming a huge dilemma, and one that's also kind of being looked at in other places. War is moving at the speed of technology, light years, but the U.S. Army moves at the speed of budgets, fiscal years. That's not going to work when a home-built quadcopter can drop a grenade and destroy a fighter jet parked on the ground, and the Defense Department is on the wrong side of the cost equation. What keeps me up is the cost imposition factor that robotics seem to bring, said Miller, the chief technology officer. A $1,500 drone can take out a multi-million-dollar aircraft. And that's another thing that we've seen in Ukraine. It just is. George has only been on the job for 6 months, but he has already taken a scalpel to the Army's weapons programs. The Army canceled the RQ-11 Raven and RQ-7 Shadow drone programs, which took nearly a decade to produce and earn the nickname Flying Lawnmower from troops miffed by their slow speed. Crash just one and it might cost the Army $1 million, enough to pay a platoon's worth of Army privates their full year's wages. And that's got to be addressed. You can't have $1 million drone, and that's our answer to the cost equation. You've got to get way cheaper, way faster. You see in Ukraine that some units there, they have 3D printers set up in their trench, and so they can basically take drones that might have received some damage. They can receive like the motor, for instance, and then build out the rest of the drone in the trench. That makes them cheap. That makes them replenishable. That makes it complicated for the Army because, again, now you're going to have to justify, what, are you going to put a 3D printer in the back of a Humvee? And, that's going to take up a lot of energy. That's going to take up a lot of equipment. How's that going to work? And so it's kind of, we're getting back to that issue on, how's the Army going to kind of evolve? And it's a slow moving machine. And not everybody's willing to think outside the box. But building up is difficult, and China is poised at virtually every part of the drone and robotics supply chain. And Project Convergence is still just an experiment. The Army hasn't been able to get most of its new technology into the budget. It's mostly on the list of unfunded priorities that George is asking Congress to add to its almost $186 billion budget request. In the next war, the Army is going to need to reprogram things instantly. With drones becoming all the rage, the Army has also canceled the big-ticket Future Attack Reconnaissance Aircraft program, which was developing a next-generation Scout helicopter. And service leaders want to end the production of one variant of Black Hawk helicopter. It's still an open question whether the Army has the authority to buy and build cheap off-the-shelf drones like the Ukrainians, though. Georgia is seeking the acquisition authority to do so, but the defense industry doesn't love the idea of the Army being less predictable weapons buyers. Many companies want the stability of multi-year contracts. And that's kind of like the garbage part of this whole issue is, the defense industry is supposed to work for the Army, not the Army work for the defense industry. We've kind of reversed the equation here. And if the defense industry is not wanting to service, if the Army is beholden to what the defense industry wants, then this is broken. And that it has to be fixed. And it has to be fixed immediately. For if these folks want a multi-year contract, then it can't be these $1 million projects. These $1 million, drone projects. Of course, that's just not how they're going to make a lot of money. If you look at what, Ukraine did very early in the war, a lot of their drones were crowdfunded. A lot of people, through online fundraising schemes, raised money for individual units to buy and have delivered these quadcopters and 3D printers. And so that's not something that's going to work in the Army, in the U.S. Army. Like they said here, it's going to have to be issued through, an Army procurement program. And if the defense industry isn't, willing to accommodate that, then that's a threat. That's a problem. The next target for belt tightening is the ponderous Distributed Common Ground System, the Army's most widely used intelligence sharing platform. Stacks of servers that resemble discarded record players with masses of wires extending from them, many of which have had to be updated by hand. Members of the brass say that they're listening to the rank and file's demands to throw out the old junk. Quote, "When someone says something is a piece of crap, that bothers me," George said. And said troops want to be running their missions from tablets and iPhones. Major General Jim Eisenhower, who leads the Army's 1st Armored Division, which, what the heck? This guy's last name is Eisenhower, not spelled the same way, but he's also an Armored Division commander. Are we getting ready for World War III? Is this the same guy reincarnated? Anyway, that's crazy. Told George during a demonstration that he believes putting command and control systems onto screens, tablets, and mixed reality applications can help him reduce the size of combat outposts by 95%, from 326 troops to about 8, so small the Army's opposition force can't even spot it during practice drills. Now that is interesting. Calling out orders from a tablet can make the Army move faster too. Before U.S. Army intelligence analysts were looking at radar and signals intercepts through the soda straw, trying to find the right line of data to see what weapons the enemy had and where they were. Now with one radar pass, U.S. troops can start to map out a Russian and Chinese unit and what kinds of guns the weapon had in its arsenal, with artificial intelligence helping to find the signal in the noise. The goal is to reduce the speed of targeting decisions to minutes and seconds in order to compete with enemies who are equally fast, if not faster. Quote, "You can defend against the first wave, great," said Colonel Scott Shaw, the director of the Army's Maneuver Capabilities Development and Integration Directorate. "We've got to condense that down. What about the 12th wave? What if the 12th wave comes in the 12th minute?" Yeah, I think that's problematic. That's pretty jarring. Plumes of smoke drifted off the desert sand and on the robot's gun barrels. The Smet vehicles that had stormed through Eugen had wheeled into position and fired javelin shots into the caldera, the valley's cauldron-like floor. In their wake, mine-clearing robots rushed in and fired a 350-foot rope lined full of explosive charge. More than 1,500 pounds of C4 explosive spooled into a tube. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, Shaw said, counting down as he waited for the charge to detonate. It did not go off, so Shaw counted down from 5 again. Again, there was no explosive. The faulty line charge was one of the few things that went visibly wrong during the exercise. In another instance, Army officials jammed themselves. A swarm of drones dropped out of the sky. If soldiers were to make these kinds of mistakes in the real battlefield today, actual human beings could get killed. And this is actually something that we've seen in Ukraine, that we've seen the Russians do, because the Russians have a pretty large and sophisticated, EW suite, but we've seen them jam themselves pretty often. We've seen them fail to deconflict. And I think deconfliction is incredibly hard. And this is an example of that. They're in a training exercise that's designed to be, more hard than the battlefield, and they're jamming themselves. Again, this is something that you try to practice, in a training environment. So when you get to the real thing, you're not doing that. But this kind of shows how, impactful that can be. If, that swarm of drones was supposed to be, the combined effort of your 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th waves, and you just jam them out of the sky, then that 12th wave that was supposed to be your game ender isn't so much of a game ender anymore. I would not want to put a human into that, said Taylor, Fort Irwin's commander, who had watched videos of Ukrainian troops trying to clear Russian minefields with the same U.S.-made explosives working under a hail of gunfire. And if you've seen those videos, yeah, it'll make you. It's pretty jarring because they don't have the luxury of clearing a minefield in a calm environment. They're clearing the minefield under fire, under direct visibility of the enemy. That's incredibly difficult. That's part of why breaching operations is so hard, and that's why drones can be huge in this kind of capacity. But unfortunately, in that case, Ukraine doesn't quite have it, and it seems that the army is still trying to figure that out themselves. Robots may be harder to kill, but you can't fix stupid either. They don't have curiosity, they don't have instincts, said General Jim Rainey, the head of the Army Futures Command. And that's certainly true. There's been some talk of like automated drones that can kind of automate fighting for you. They will automatically target and kill targets for you. But you need a soldier with a human brain to be doing that, because again, not only differentiating friend from foe, differentiating, civilian from enemy, but also thinking outside the box and creative thinking. That's incredibly valuable in the army, especially for problem solving. And robots, they only, AI knows what we've taught it. It's trying to mimic the things that we've taught it. But in terms of creativity, again, it's a mimic of creativity. It's not true actual creativity. But the idea of creating robots that do have curiosity and instincts is also terrifying. Are military officials worried about creating Terminators? George, the Army chief, said that he's not. You're talking about completely autonomous vehicles, he said. Everything out there was controlled by a soldier. Experts acknowledge that the robots of the future may need two sets of rules. One for peacetime and another for war. With Russian troops invading their country, the Ukrainian military doesn't care very much for the safety features such as kill switches, which would force a robot to cease all operations if it gets a command that it's not signed with the encryption codes of the right controller. Again, yeah, it gets kind of interesting, but kind of like what it's saying about Ukraine. You're caring more about fighting and winning. Whatever works, right? You're throwing everything at them. The United Nations, on the other hand, cares a lot about such things. The UN General Assembly's first committee approved a draft resolution on autonomous weapons in November, declaring that a human should always be in the loop. The law of warfare is how we're going to apply robotic systems, said Miller, Georgia's chief technology officer. But scientists are still at the ground level of building out the field robotics. Just like the Stanford University professors who built the network protocols that led to the internet, quote, they didn't envision the internet, so they didn't envision all the ways that people could abuse the internet, said Miller. The scariest circumstances is not Skynet, Miller said. The scariest circumstance is that it comes under the enemy's control. Now, this is a really good article, and this is the new arms race. It's AI is one of them. Robotics and drones is another. And part of that arms race is who can learn the best lessons the quickest from this war in Ukraine, and who can, apply those lessons to their force on the grand scale. I think a benefit that the U.S. Army has is it has a very intelligent people in very important positions that see the issue and are trying to fix it. And they're not stuck in kind of, at least the ones that I've met, and it seems like here, they're not stuck in kind of that old mindset. They realize that, okay, now's the time to innovate. Now's the time to continue to evolve, because the battlefield is evolving and we have to evolve with it. And I think, from what I've seen, again, the Army has done a decent job of kind of removing from the service people that are not willing to evolve with the time. That being said, we talked a little bit about the defense industrial base here. It's not working. It is not working for the Army. It's not working for U.S. defense. In fact, it's expecting U.S. defense to work for it. And I think that's a huge, huge problem. And, the Army can learn these lessons all at once, but if it can't get the defense industrial base to basically build that at a grand scale, then we're just as screwed as we were before. So, learning these lessons is definitely one thing. Refining the technology and getting it, built how we want it is definitely another. But implementing that, scaling that out at a big, scope that's really where this is going to become, a game-winning or game-losing kind of thing. So I think that's kind of what we're seeing here, that this has to be addressed here, but there's a lot going on here. So I want to get your thoughts down in the comments. What do you think of this article? What do you think about, the future of drone warfare and AI and its impact in the battlefield? What are your thoughts? Tell me your thoughts. Subscribe for more analysis, not only on defense, but also on the war in Ukraine and also on the war in the Middle East. And like this video if you found it helpful or informative. With all that, I'll see y'all next time. Later.